As someone who loves games, movies, TV shows, and the discourse that surrounds them, I have grown increasingly agitated by the degradation of what passes as media criticism on sites like YouTube, particularly with many of these self-identified critics' inability to differentiate between objectivity and preference. I'll bring up specific examples later in the video, but first, let's establish a baseline and make sure we're all on the same page. While there are objective elements in art, the majority of what determines why someone likes a piece of media is left up to personal preference. On an objective level, we can point out when a game is riddled with bugs or a shot's out of focus. Those are objective flaws, but unless they are incredibly prevalent, their impact is negligible. Skyrim is an incredibly buggy game, and yet it is still considered a masterpiece. Personally, I love the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I think they are fantastic films, and are pretty much objectively good by every conceivable metric. However, in spite of that, I have multiple friends who don't like the films at all. Not because they think they are objectively awful or anything, but rather because they think the pacing is too slow, or they prefer the way the books told the story, or they just aren't really into fantasy. None of those critiques are wrong, and are perfectly valid reasons to not like the films, but they are far from objective. On the opposite end, Supernatural is objectively a pretty bad TV show. It has massive plot holes, inconsistent character motivations, poorly filmed scenes, abandoned plot threads, it suffers from extreme power creep, and destroys its own tension by constantly killing Sam and Dean only to revive them in the next episode. In spite of all of that, I love Supernatural, and so do many others, because of its characters, its tone, its mythological elements, and because it's just fun to watch. Yeah, sure, I could make a video essay on each season that would make the show sound worse than The Rise of Skywalker, but none of that matters, because what the show does right is infinitely more important to me than what it does wrong. Looking at media through an objective lens can be very useful, but it can only tell you so much. You can identify each aspect of a piece of media, but how those aspects are weighted is up to the preference of each individual. Visual spectacle is great, but it's weighted very low for me. I'm not going to care about a movie just because it looks pretty. It needs to have characters and a plot that I find compelling in order for me to like it. Avatar 2: The Way of Water is objectively a good film. It's a technical marvel and has a well-presented story. But I was bored for damn near its entirety. You can't objectively decide if art speaks to someone. You can figure out if it spoke to you, and you can guess at how others will react, but you can never know until they find out for themselves. Consequently, it's impossible for a reviewer or critic to know if you will like a piece of media. At best, they're giving you an educated guess. And that's assuming the reviewer even understands why they do or don't like the piece of media in the first place. We all like to think we have a good understanding of why we like what we like, and the reality is, that's just not true. Most people don't think too deeply about their opinions. They might have a vague idea of why they like or dislike something, but when put under scrutiny, those ideas are often revealed to be misconceptions. I'm a big Sonic fan. I'm partial to the adventure era, and I mainly like the Sonic franchise because of its gameplay, so when I played Spark the Electric Jester 3, it quickly became my favorite Sonic game, even though it's not a Sonic game. I got one of my friends into it since he also really likes Sonic, and this friend claimed he liked Sonic because of the gameplay and characters equally. However, he wasn't very into Spark 3 when he started playing it, and after talking to him about it, we pretty quickly realized that the characters of Sonic were far more integral to his enjoyment of Sonic games than he'd initially thought. An individual isn't wrong for liking or not liking a piece of media, however, that doesn't mean opinions can't be based on poorly justified foundations. On a personal level, I don't really care for The Witcher 3. I know, that's heresy. And to be clear, I don't think the game's bad. I just don't find the world's dark and dreary nature to be very interesting, and it uses a combat style that I've historically never enjoyed. Neither of those things make The Witcher bad, they just don't align with my personal taste, so whenever I try to get into the game, and I have tried plenty of times, I never succeed. My opinion of Witcher 3 is based on an understanding of my own preferences, and therefore is totally valid. However, if I was to claim that The Witcher 3 is bad because it has boring writing, that would be completely off base, because I'd be conflating my personal disinterest in the world with the quality of the writing, and implying that my opinion has some level of objectivity through my verbiage. Me not liking the game would still be valid, but my justification and how I expressed my opinion wouldn't be. When analyzing a piece of art, objectivity is useful, but what is more important is being able to understand your own preferences and how that influences the way you view a piece. When it comes to most online critics though, especially those that brand themselves as objective, they very rarely understand this. What is masqueraded as objectivity is more often than not simply appealing to personal preferences in an authoritative tone, but that doesn't make their opinions objective. I don't really like League of Legends. I think it's a well-made game, but it just isn't for me. However, because I don't care about League of Legends, I initially dismissed its TV show, Arcane. I watched the first episode because a friend asked me to, but I didn't really give it a fair chance. Frankly, I wasn't very open to liking it. Because I had a vague dislike for League, I had subconsciously decided that I didn't care about its world. After giving it a day or two, I came back to the show with a more open mind, and I absolutely loved it. As far as biases go, my dislike for League is a pretty small one, but it was still enough to impact the way I engaged with Arcane. This epitomizes why I like thinking about my own biases and presuppositions, because one unaddressed bias, even a minute one, can make a big difference. Everyone has biases, but there are two that very often pervade online discussion. The first is expectation. It's not exactly insightful to point out that someone's expectations massively impact how they view a piece of media. Despite the self-evident nature of this claim, don't underestimate how much expectations blind people. At release, BioShock 2 got a ton of hate that was almost entirely baseless and unwarranted. It's very similar to the first game in terms of gameplay, but with a few notable improvements like the hacking minigame, and the story now centers around Sophia Lamb turning Rapture into a collectivist society, which stands in stark contrast to Andrew Ryan's emphasis on individualism. It's a fairly clever approach for a sequel in my opinion, and has many great moments, especially in the Minerva's Den DLC. That's one of the best DLCs ever made. Many have come around to BioShock 2 in retrospect, but the exceedingly high expectations placed on the game caused a great game that is at worst an underwhelming sequel to be hated to an unreasonable degree. There are countless pieces of media that have received this treatment, from the Star Wars prequels to the Callisto Protocol. Both of those examples have flaws, but are aggressively overhated. And I'm sure you can think of plenty of other examples yourself. The second bias is the prevailing narrative. In the modern age, before a piece of media is even released, there is already a narrative that is formed around it, which will color how people engage with it. Probably the best example of this is the recent Rings of Power show. Regardless of what you think of the show, the impact of the narrative surrounding it is clear as day. People hated it long before it ever came out, and numerous reviewers were calling it total garbage after only watching the first episode. Which is an extreme overreaction, and is a great example of the narrative being more important than the media itself. Another example of narratives impacting games is the partisan hackery that occurs every time a console-exclusive game is released, as fanboys on both sides frantically try to control the narrative and claim that the game is a masterpiece or a complete failure before the games have even been released. My favorite complaint that gained prominence is that Horizon Forbidden West was woke garbage because Aloy had peach fuzz and was too ugly. It's so obviously stupid, it's amazing, but there are people that actually believe this crap. I've also heard that The Last of Us 2 got an exceedingly bad rap from friends whose opinions I trust, but I can't be certain as I have never played it myself, and given that it's a zombie game, I probably never will. Yet another great example is how certain reviews came down absurdly hard on Glass Onion because the internet hates Rian Johnson, the director who made The Last Jedi, and therefore every film he makes must fit the narrative that he is a horrible director that should never be allowed to make another movie. Preconceived notions, expectations, and narratives can determine how open an individual is to liking a piece of media, as if you know what you're supposed to think, it's a lot easier to default to that position. So based on this video, you'd be forgiven for thinking that I really dislike critics, full stop. But that isn't true. Critics and criticism are really important. Probably the main reason for this is that the media landscape is extremely oversaturated. There are too many games to play and too many movies to watch. Most people don't have the time or money to experience every piece of media that is released, so they turn to reviews to help figure out what is worth spending their time and money on, turning critics into curators of sorts. While I disagree with the methods of many critics, this is an important function to serve. Secondly, many people love socializing about media. However, given how much media there is out there, there's no guarantee that any of your friends will like the same media that you like. And in that sense, reviews and video essays serve as a great way to engage with the discussion surrounding a piece of media, which is another function of critics that is worth preserving. At the end of the day, the biggest issue with YouTube critics is that they are just regular people who are uploading their opinions to the internet, and the vast majority of them fall prey to the exact same pitfalls when analyzing media as any other person would. This is a major reason I think reviews should strive to look at media in a broader context and from multiple perspectives. A review that simply shares a perspective isn't very useful to a viewer unless that viewer is already aware of the reviewer's preferences. Sharing personal experiences is great and all, but I don't think simply doing that constitutes a review. That's more of a discussion. In this section, I'm going to point out examples of videos that I think represent the issues I've been talking about throughout the video. I want to make it very clear that I don't think the people who made these videos are bad people or anything. Most of them just presented their viewpoints in a way that I disagree with. I will assume good faith for all of these critics. Until the end. You'll see. One issue I often have with reviews is when they blur the line between comedy and criticism. One of the worst offenders for this is zero punctuation. For example, take this clip from their BioShock 2 review. For context, in BioShock 2 there are these girls called Little Sisters, and you can either save them, turning them back into a human, or harvest them for extra resources. If you harvest them, you're a monster, but saving them does take extra effort. Anyway, when you save or harvest one in BioShock 2, a big sister will occasionally attack you. Here's what Zero Punctuation had to say about this system.
And both options have a chance of spawning a big sister, so if you say you used up all your health and ammo defending your little sister, then it's time to take a probe right up the Mariana Trench. Here's an idea, 2K, how about only spawning a big sister if I take the evil harvest option? Surely that would give the big sister a valid reason to be cross, otherwise she's all like, grr, your selfless compassion fills me with murder frenzy.
These points are really, really bad. First off, in the game story, big sisters want to keep little sisters as little sisters, so whether you rescue the little sister or harvest her would have no bearing on whether the big sister would want to kill you or not. And secondly, you have less resources to fight the big sister after protecting the little sister because that's the point. It's meant to be harder to save the little sister than to harvest her. I can't believe I have to explain that, but okay. There is no way to know whether the reviewer just wasn't paying attention to the game or whether he intentionally ignored common sense for the sake of a punchline. Either way, when jokes and criticisms are mixed, the result tends to be bad points that are obfuscated by jokes. This allows the reviewer to impart their opinions on a game without having the audience think too critically about the validity of said opinions. Because, idealistically, they're too busy laughing at that latest knee slapper. Not to mention the "it was just a joke" defense is a great way to hide from criticism. Humor can add a lot to a review, but I hate it when jokes are used to distract from bad points. Another trend that annoys the hell out of me is when critics insult the creator of the work and insinuate that they know better. It's a pure display of arrogance and reveals a complete and utter disregard for the amount of thought and effort that goes into major media projects. Easily the worst example I've seen of this is from Red Letter Media.
It just shows that he doesn't know what's happening in the scene.
Yeah.
Or with the characters.
Or doesn't care.
Amazing.
Or doesn't care what's really happening in the scene.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, when he's thinking about that specific bit, but not in the context of the overall movie. Like,
so what you're saying is George Lucas has a limited mental focus, a limited intelligence.
I just... George Lucas made Star Wars and has a deep understanding of filmmaking and film history. If you are even remotely media literate, you'll notice countless visual references to westerns and silent films in Star Wars. So to sit there and say that George Lucas is too stupid to understand storytelling is mind-boggling to me. How do you say that? And no, I don't care if it was said in a slightly joking tone, because it's clearly getting at a deeper belief. Critics will often position themselves as being smarter or more insightful than the people who make the media they're criticizing. On its own, it's a generally telling display of arrogance as well as ignorance, but the more insidious part of this is that it also fosters that same mentality in their viewers. Moving on, let's talk about one of my least favorite reviews on the internet, SkillUp's review of Deathloop. Now, I normally quite like SkillUp, but this video perfectly exemplifies so many issues I have with YouTube reviews. In this review, SkillUp talks about why he didn't enjoy Deathloop, and the core complaint boils down to, this isn't the game he wanted it to be. He wants it to be more like Prey Mooncrash. Hell, he spends the first 4 minutes talking about it and constantly brings it up throughout the video. He says that Deathloop's systems lack complexity, time should move with the player, the AI is stupid, the game is too easy, the puzzles are bad, enemy variety is lacking, and constantly mentions ways he thinks the game could be improved. While I like Deathloop, many of the issues SkillUp mentions in this video are completely valid reasons to not like the game. And on a personal level, I would love to play the game that SkillUp imagined Deathloop would be. But what he fails to recognize is that Deathloop isn't trying to be a successor to Prey Mooncrash. It's trying to be a fun sandbox to mess around in, and uses the time loop mechanic to encourage people to approach levels in different ways on each loop. Meanwhile, Mooncrash is about building tension through resource conservation, planning, and tough enemies. While both of these games are time loop games made by Arcane Studios, they have entirely different goals. Although I do have to stop and point out that Prey Mooncrash is phenomenal and it is extremely underrated, so he is right about that. Anyway, as the video continues, SkillUp admits that he brute forced the game and didn't engage with the stealth, but dismisses this as a potential criticism by saying,
I'm sure that some people will respond by saying that I'm missing the point. You can do it this way, but you're meant to study and you're meant to learn and make use of the sandbox. That's the whole point of the game. Sure, but like, what is there to learn, really? You've got one enemy type. It's not like you're learning the weakness of dozens of different enemies and you switch between weapons and abilities to exploit those weaknesses in different ways. You can just stick them with the pointy end and it'll work. Every time. That's it.
I don't think I need to explain why this isn't a great argument. The point of the game is to engage with the sandbox for the intrinsic fun of engaging with the sandbox. No, the difficulty of the game won't force you to, but by rejecting that aspect of the game, SkillUp is entirely missing the point of the game. If he doesn't want to mess with the sandbox, that's fine, but don't pretend that critique is grounded in objectivity. That would be like playing Warframe and only playing Rhino and then complaining that the game has no gameplay variety because you weren't forced to use a different Warframe. Yeah, you can get by using just Rhino, but if you never play with any other Warframes, you're ignoring one of the major draws of the game, and to critique the game on that basis would be absurd. Wanting Deathloop to be harder is valid, but using that as an excuse to actively play the game in a way that is antithetical to its intended design, and using that experience to shit all over the game is asinine. On top of that, he consistently presents his opinions as though they are objective, like how he asserts that the game would be better if time moved while you were playing. I think that would be an interesting choice, and I honestly might have liked it more, but that isn't objective. Time doesn't advance in levels specifically to facilitate players taking their time and playing the level however they want. The two styles achieve very different ends. Having a preference in that regard is fine, but presenting it as objective is just inaccurate. He also presents Prey Mooncrash as just being a better version of Deathloop, which, again, no it's not. They do entirely different things. To his credit, SkillUp does eventually acknowledge his one-sidedness and explains why he doesn't feel he needs to bring up any positives.
By the way, I know I'm laying it on really thick here, I get it. I'm not blind to the fact that this has just been like 25 minutes of me railing on this game, but this is what I think, so I'm just gonna continue. There are things that I liked about Deathloop, but I don't think the purpose of a review is to give you a list of pros and cons. It's to tell you what I think and explain why I think it.
Yeah, I hard disagree on this point. The purpose of a review is to inform the viewer about a product and help them come to an informed conclusion on whether it is worth their time. To that end, playing a game in expressly the wrong way and whinging about it for 30 minutes is entirely ineffective. It would be one thing if the video was titled something like, Why I Didn't Like Deathloop, and it was framed as SkillUp discussing his personal preferences, but it is expressly presented as a review and recommendation on whether to play the game. SkillUp also says that him making an overly biased review won't change anything, and references the game's 86% positive score on Steam. Well, now, a year later, that score is down to 77%. Now, I don't think that's all on SkillUp. Deathloop had plenty of critics, but when your video gets 700,000 views, it's going to make a difference, whether you like it or not, and feigning ignorance doesn't change that. This is a perfect encapsulation of a review that is informed by bias and misplaced expectations, while presenting preferences as objective observations, with the creator actively ignoring the fact that how they present their views absolutely influences the way a piece of media is perceived. Again, I don't hate SkillUp or anything. He seems like a nice guy and he generally makes good videos. Hell, I have him to thank for getting me into Warframe, and I love that game. But this video does just about everything wrong. Giving the benefit of the doubt, critics like SkillUp, Red Letter Media, and Zero Punctuation likely don't mean any harm in their videos, and just present viewpoints they believe to be true in irresponsible or poorly thought through ways. But some reviews do a lot worse than that. So, let's move on to the darker side of the issue. While I have problems with how creators articulate their views, I still largely respect them because I know how much effort it takes to make a video. But that respect fades when we start talking about outrage channels, whose sole purpose is to maliciously rile up angry people by misrepresenting and lying about media. This type of channel really started taking off after The Last Jedi was released, and they tend to be focused on major brands like Star Wars, Marvel, or Lord of the Rings. Their content consists of pointing out minor plot holes or issues and making them out to be the worst issues imaginable, while offering very little in the way of nuanced or substantive critique, all the while calling anything they don't like bad writing. They even stoop to misrepresenting the truth or straight up lying fairly often. An example of this would be the claim that Galadriel in Rings of Power is a Mary Sue. This claim has been repeated ad nauseum, yet is entirely false. A Mary Sue is a character that is unrealistically perfect, has no flaws, and makes no mistakes. Whether you like her character or not, Galadriel is blatantly not a Mary Sue. She is expressly presented as being arrogant and consumed by a desire for vengeance, and she's constantly criticized for that in the show. I'm gonna spoil something for Rings of Power Season 1, so if you care, skip to the timecode on screen. Okay, you gone? Okay, cool. She's even responsible for bringing Sauron to meet Celebrimbor, so you could make the case that she is in no small part responsible for the return of Sauron, so yeah, Mary Sue my ass. One channel that makes this type of content and thrives on negativity is Night's Watch. Just scrolling through their uploads paints a pretty great picture of what this channel is all about. I bring them up because I noticed something hilarious when I was looking into these channels more for this video. They were shit-talking Andor before it came out, saying, Star Wars has given up. They covered the first 3 episodes of the show, calling them boring, and then they covered episodes 4 and 5, saying the show might be getting better, but with a thumbnail face that very much implied otherwise. And then, once it became apparent that everyone really liked the show, they just stopped covering it. I wonder why. There are countless channels like this, and in fairness, I do think Shad and his crew probably believe most of what they say. Doesn't make it that much better, but anyway. So, for the final creator I want to talk about, let's look at one of the worst channels that makes this type of content. The Critical Drinker. I was going to talk about how he completely lied about what happened in Glass Onion, but then I saw this video. So, I'll instead link to Pillar of Garbage's video about Drinker's Glass Onion review, and let's talk about this instead. The basic thesis of this video is that modern movies suck because writers are trying to feminize men by making them too emotional. This video is a damn goldmine. There are so many stupid quotes, it's actually impressive. This entire video feels like one long gish gallop. He throws out so many unsubstantiated points back to back with no attempt to back up any claim with evidence. One of my favorites is his claim that stoic men are hard to write for. I'm sorry, what? No, they're not. It's actually one of the simplest. They're confident and restrained, only talk when they need to, and they're very proactive. It's not hard to write by any stretch. I don't think the archetype is bad. I really like a lot of stoic heroes in film, but to pretend like it's more difficult to write than other characters is absurd. Hey, Skull, how's it going? Would you say that your character Banarak is a stoic character?
Yeah, I'd say so. He's very restrained, not as emotional, and gets angry when he needs to.
Okay, alright. Would you say he is a particularly hard character to write?
No, not really. No, he's pretty straightforward to write.
And then there is this absolutely genius follow-up to that statement.
The reality is that most of the time, men just don't feel things as deeply as people seem to imagine. They don't tend to get hung up on things in the same way that other people do. They don't constantly fret and worry over trivial problems. They don't like to be disrespected or treated as the weak link in the chain, and they generally don't complain about minor discomforts or things that nobody can actually fix, because they find that kind of behaviour annoying and off-putting in other people.
Men just don't feel things as deeply as people seem to imagine. Why does this channel have so many subs? Okay, ignoring how stupid that is on its face, I have a question for the Critical Drinker. If men simply don't feel much emotion, then what exactly makes a stoic man a respectable archetype to aspire to? Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought the stoic man was inspirational because they felt things just as much as everyone else, but managed to control their emotions and focus on what needs to be done. If stoic men are stoic, not because they have composure and restraint, but instead because they're just empty husks that feel nothing? Well, there's nothing particularly respectable about that, is there? It's incredibly ironic that the Drinker is so consumed with his hatred for emotional men that he completely misses the point of the stoic man. You can't make this crap up. I dislike these creators a fair bit, because not only do they have very little to offer in the way of actual criticism, but as the Drinker video made very clear, their videos aren't about movies or TV shows. They're actually about the culture war. The whole scheme of these channels is to draw in angry fans and then capitalize on that anger to convert them into their worldview by using misleading rhetoric. That worldview being that Hollywood hates white men and new films are bad because they have diversity, ooh. Even if you agree with their worldview, which you shouldn't, by the way, but even if you do, the fact that their worldview has such a massive impact on their critiques should be sending up red flags all over the place. It's about as blatant as bias can get. If you like this type of content, please understand that while they might make points you agree with about films you don't like, that doesn't mean they're right about everything, and that first point of agreement is how they hook you. And all that's without even going into how these channels have a massive financial incentive to hate any new media that is released. Also, I know there are channels like this for gaming too, but I'm not too familiar with them, so I refrain from bringing them up in this video. These creators are a blight on online media discourse. Anyway, that got kinda serious. Regardless, I think that these videos illustrate that independent YouTube reviewers can be really untrustworthy at times. So, I've highlighted a number of problems I see in the online media criticism sphere, and hopefully I've convinced you that at least a few of my claims are valid. So, what are the solutions? In an ideal world, all content creators would become more reasonable with how they represent their ideas, become more aware of their own biases, and understand the influence that they have over their audience. But that isn't gonna happen, so as a consumer of YouTube media discourse, you could seek out channels that tend to be more objective and balanced in their reviews, but the main thing though would be to think more critically about the media discourse you consume, as well as your assumptions about media. Understand that any reviewer you watch will be impacted by their biases and probably won't present their views in the best way. And as cheesy as it sounds, Think for yourself. If there's a game you know you're going to play or a movie you know you're going to watch, remove yourself from the online discourse, go in blind, and form your own opinion. Even if you don't do that, just being aware of people's biases as well as your own can make a massive difference in how you engage with media. I would encourage all of you to simply think about this stuff more often, and don't blindly trust critics or the prevailing narrative. Think for yourself instead, because when it comes to art, it is never wrong to have a different opinion. Anyway, that's pretty much all I got. I would love to hear what you thought about the video in a comment down below. I'd be especially curious to know how you all engage with the media surrounding the games and films or whatever that you like. And let me know if this video made you rethink anything. Anyway, for the usual spill, if you liked the video, like it, subscribe if you want. I tend to make video essays about pieces of media that I really like, so there's that. Feel free to join my Discord, I'm fairly active in there. Alright, I'll see y'all next time. Bye.